Here we go. Share and play.
Perfect. Can see it, can hear you.
Yeah, fortunately, my cursor tends to disappear, so I can't move. Anyway, won't bother about it. Okay, so I'll just start then. So thanks, Tom, first of all, for inviting me to speak at this. I'm a bit of an outlier, obviously, to the group, but you might find, the perspective that I take on the work that you're doing from the perspective from my position, helpful, interesting. I don't know. So let's see, I need to, why can't I? Oh, okay. So to borrow a phrase from the Talking Heads, how did I get here? Well, what you've done today, and this is sort of connecting what I'm about to do with what you've all done. We've heard a lot about various, genetic, neurophysiological, anatomical, and behavioral markers of stress. And so from my perspective, you might begin asking, well, what exactly is stress? I mean, we haven't really gotten a definition. Although there was actually one partly, but one way that a philosopher, which I am trained as, might address this, what is stress, is to start with armchair conceptual analysis. I'm not going to do that. Instead, as a philosopher of science, one way that people think about, the concepts that are used in science is to look at the behavior of scientists and what they do with the concepts. And that means essentially using you as the targets of my research and your behavior. So the kind of question that I'm going to ask, that I've been thinking about, of course, is when you talk about markers, right? What are the phenotypes of which species do you count or accept as evidence of stress, right? So this is all implicit in your behavior, these are the sorts of species and these are the sorts of behaviors that you consider as evidence of stress. And you accept these, presumably because you have a working definition of some sort, could be an operational definition of some sort, of a particular stress character. So one of the earlier talks by David Vallaley gave a quick definition of stress as responses of organisms to pressures, threats, and constraints that are established to recover homeostasis or well-being. And I have a couple of red X's there on the screen because it's not just any response, so what was written as a definition seemed to be just a purely functional one. But of course, it's not just any response you're looking at, right? So there are implicit sorts of observable criteria that count as the responses. And all of this is implicit in what you do. And I should mention also, there's the little niggling term well-being there. So it's not, how are we defining that? So this is just a working sort of way to kind of start to get at the stress character. People will still ask, well, is this a good definition? I mean, are you observing things in your species that suggest there should be a redefinition of stress, and so forth? And I'm interested in these sorts of redefinitions because they reveal how scientists think about the characters that they're observing and trying to define. So where I am and what this talk is about is really, what if you're working in a science that doesn't even recognize the concept of a character, doesn't make the distinction between a phenotype and a character? And that's kind of where I'm going, right? So this will become clear as I go. Okay, so the plan of my talk are these, oops, I left out the number one. But anyway, the upshot, if I had to, summarize everything in one sentence, it would be to show that there are institutional differences that embody conceptual differences, and these come from historical attitudes. Okay, so first part is, what are the differences? Why do we have these differences? And then, of course, why should we care? So if you talk about evolutionary biology, just plain straightforward Wikipedia definition, it's the subfield of biology that studies the evolutionary processes that produce the diversity of life on Earth, right? And I think, I would agree. I think that seems to be a perfectly fine definition. If you look at, if you look at evolutionary psychology, also from Wikipedia, you get a sort of a strange difference. And I wish I could move my, get rid of this. Okay, there we go. So the first definition is a theoretical approach in psychology that examines cognition and behavior from a modern evolutionary perspective. It seeks to explain human psychological adaptations with regard to ancestral problems they were designed to solve. Okay, so the first sentence doesn't say anything about humans, but the second sentence makes that explicit. And the idea is in this definition that we're talking about the evolution of human cognition. So it's specific to a particular species, and it is restricted in its, thinking about evolution in terms of adaptation. There's also a second definition, which identifies evolutionary psychology with a specific research program, which I'm sure some of you at least have heard of Cosmides and Tube and Barco, Pinker, and others, in which they have a specific theoretical stance in which these minds are made up of cognitive modules, such as the cheater detection module, and these are adaptations to Pleistocene hunter-gatherer conditions. Okay. Just to, these two can be discussed separately, so Buller has a nice thing. Some say it's simply the study of human behavior from an evolutionary perspective. That's roughly the first definition, but several prominent researchers have held that an evolutionary perspective entails specific doctrines. Okay, so you get these two different definitions, but they're very different from, both of them are very different from the definition of evolutionary biology. So on the one, as I mentioned, the limitation to thinking about evolution as just adaptation. Evolutionary biology, you all have talked about, homologies, and, homologies are lineages of characters, and you also got convergent evolution and so forth. But when we've been talking about the vertebrate brain here, we've been talking about the character, and then you've got your specific phenotypes and all the different individuals in the different species that you've been looking at. Evolutionary psychology does not have this framework. It really doesn't have a stable concept of character as distinguished from phenotype. And I'll return to that. And I should mention perceptual psychology is fine. So I've been looking at a case with stereopsis, somebody in Tom's research group, where stereopsis is a visual ability, and that there isn't any problem there. We understand stereopsis as something that is defined across a number of species. It's not specific to humans, even though it was first found in humans, like 130 years before it was found in anything else. Okay, so when I say psychology as a whole, there are parts of it, perceptual psychology, that are closely related to particular mechanisms and organs like eyes, and they don't have the same problems, which is an interesting difference. Okay, so the really damaging part, of course, is the limitation to humans, right? So evolutionary biology is a subfield of a subfield, right? Comparative biology. And even though it's a subfield, the results are kind of the conceptual foundation of all of biology, because everybody kind of takes for granted evolution, right? So when we talk about human brains, we recognize, even if we're a human biologist, a human neuroscientist, we don't forget the fact that we're talking about a vertebrate brain. When we talk about stress hormones, the different, neurotransmitters, these are homologous, they're the same molecule in different species and so forth. Evolutionary psychology is a subfield of some sort, but it's not a subfield of comparative psychology. And at best, it captures just one foundation bit of human psychology. In other words, what did our phenotypes, what are they adapted for? And in fact, comparative psychology and animal cognition are pretty much synonymous, which is odd. And then responses to results from comparative psychology are usually just, sort of, ways of pushing back to defend some view of human uniqueness. So to kind of picture this difference, I've made this fairly crude not to scale drawing. So in biology, you've got all of the creatures, that there are, right? Plants as well. I should have put a plant in there. And then you have a subset, which is, comparative biology. And then within that, you've got evolutionary biology. And all of the creatures that you see here in the larger sphere are included in the smaller spheres as well. In contrast, in psychology is pretty much human. I mean, as a whole, if you look at a psychology department, the vast majority of people are doing humans, right? Developmental, social, cognitive, it's mostly human. And then you've got comparative psychology, which is this little tiny corner, and that's where all the rest of nature is shoved in that little circle. And then you've got evolutionary psychology, which by the definitions we've just seen is again just the humans, right? And just, how we might have been adapted to hunter-gatherer society in the Pleistocene. There's a little bit of overlap, so I'm not denying that, you do get a little bit of the animals in there, but this is in general the way that psychology is an institution, evolutionary psychology as a sort of institutional subpart, and if you compare that to biology as an institution compared to evolutionary biology, they're quite different, right? Okay, so why do we have why these differences, right? So the limit to adaptation is it's changing, but it's, general, this idea that not a recognition that there is more to evolution than adaptation. And I said that is changing, but there is more attention obviously to mechanisms, to ontogeny. But with respect, at least to phylogeny, the existence of other species other than the human is usually acknowledged in the context of trying to identify what's unique about the human mind. Okay. What is, bigger, I think, and more influential is the limitation to humans, right? So there's a whole history, thousands of years, of limitations of psychology to human. In fact, the term psyche, is from the Greek. So on the left here, you have Aristotle's hierarchy of what he called souls. So on his view, anything that was alive had a nutritive soul. You can think of that as roughly equivalent to a metabolism. Some of those that have nutritive souls also had what he calls sensitive souls, and this was all and only animals, right? They moved around, they sensed, right? So that's kind of perceptual stuff. And then among those that had sensitive souls, you have an even more restricted category of rational souls, right? And that's only humans, right? So humans are the only ones that have a whole 3 types of souls. Everything else has less. So there's a restriction, being human is being rational and nothing else is rational. Nothing else is human, right? The borders of being human and being rational, having mind, are necessarily coincidental. Then you get, of course, figures like Descartes, who thought that the mind also was only restricted to humans. Animals were just machines. And he added to that as well dualism, right? The idea that the soul could survive the death of the body, which was not part of Aristotle, I should say. And then finally, you have this whole elaborate medieval and etc. Elaboration of the Scala Naturae, which was a ladder of being, of existence leading up to God. God is the perfect being, and everything on earth and in the angels as well were in the ladder. Everything had its portion of being ordered by perfection. And having reason was a perfection making aspect of being. So we are higher on this hierarchy of being because we have reason. And below us, of course, are animals who don't, or if they do, it's lesser, and so on down to the rocks. Okay. And this again is very influential. It puts us up on top. It's, you know, we have higher cognition, everything else, and nothing else has what we have. So there's a huge history of thinking about the mind, of psychology, anything above sensing as exclusively human and restricted to the human species necessarily. So I'll just go through that. Then you get to Darwin and post-Darwin, right? So Darwin's contemporary, Alfred Russel Wallace, thought that everything evolves except the human mind, right? Mortimer Adler, philosopher and theologian, with a more Cartesian view that the human mind is immaterial and also not subject to evolution. So there's a resistance that continues to the idea that mind even evolved. This is not, nowadays, of course, we accept that mind evolved. And of course, that's what evolutionary psychology is all about. But the acceptance always comes with this caveat of, well, how are we unique, right? And so you have Dobzhansky and Chomsky and Povinelli and many people making all kinds of claims about humans being uniquely capable of lots of different things, conscious decision-making, conceptual thought, language, mind reading, and so forth. And what's interesting about these claims is that they're made without distinguishing between the human phenotype of, say, decision-making or mind reading and any kind of character that might be individuated across species, the way you guys take for granted with, brains or even stress responses. And so what happens is when you have a conceptual framework where you don't have even a concept of a character, you get a lot of ambiguous sorts of questions. So I like to ask, annoying diagnostic questions like, when somebody says humans uniquely have such and such, then I just want to know, are you referring to X as a character or X as a human phenotype? Because human phenotypes are, of course, trivially unique to us. If a character is unique to us, that's a different story. But that's not trivial. But of course, we don't know that's true because we haven't even defined the characters yet for the most part. We also continue to use human phenotypes as exemplars in the concept literature sense, where something belongs to a category on the basis of its similarity to some, exemplar. And so we look at others and we see, well, we have episodic memory. So do these corvids have, they have something episodic memory like, right? Where they don't have real episodic memory because it's not quite similar to us. And so that again, it's like no non-human species can have any human phenotype. So if you're defining your cognitive categories by human phenotypes, the game is already over before it begins for the other species. So again, I like to say, well, when you're making this comparison, are the compared homology, are these homologous, right? Just to raise the issue of, are you thinking about these as, things that are defined across species or not? Okay. So that's why there's a sort of basic conceptual confusion about the questions that are being asked when you're talking about human uniqueness. It also perpetuates a certain anthropocentric bias. I mean, we've seen that, a history of thinking of non-humans as, not having any sort of reason or higher reason. And so without having characters as a kind of, common currency for making comparisons, we still tend to look for similarity to human phenotypes, right? Even though we don't know which in many cases, at least in cognition, we don't know which features of the human phenotype are common to a character and which are specific to the human phenotype, right? So we can distinguish a human brain from a primate brain or a vertebrate brain as the topic of this symposium. We can distinguish. I mean, we know the human brain is a particular phenotype of the vertebrate brain. It is a vertebrate brain, right? So we have a pretty good idea of which aspects of a human brain are specific to our phenotype and which are not. We don't have that distinction for a lot of cognition. And we also know independently that superficial similarity is not always reliable as an indicator of the sameness of character. And my favorite example here, of course, is the narwhal's tusk, which is a canine tooth. Doesn't look anything like our canine teeth, and yet it is a determinant of the same character. Okay. So, again, why should we care? I think, first of all, if we understood, if we could get psychology as a whole to think about its subject matter, psychology, as the way that evolutionary biologists and biologists in general do, I think it would help clarify certain distinct evolutionary research questions. For example, trying to define different cognitive characters and novelty versus defining human cognitive phenotypes, right? I mean, those are two different things. And of course, the latter depends on the former. And of course, the question of how cognition evolved is not identical to the question, how did human cognition evolve, right? The latter depends on the former. And very often, I mean, contextually, you can understand that when somebody is doing evolution of cognition, they mean the evolution of human cognition. That's a perfectly fine research question, but of course, there's another research question that is behind that one. It would also help clarify certain comparative research aims. So there is, when you look at a new species or even one that you've been looking at for a while, you've been looking at its phenotypes, that work helps contribute, again, to defining the characters, right? You may have started with an initial definition. You find out things about your animal, its phenotypes, and those can prompt better ways to define the character that you started with. That's one research aim. And some people actually, do this, right? They're working. As I mentioned, I'm looking at some of work by Vivek Nityananda and his colleagues who have suggested redefinitions of stereopsis based in their research with the praying mantis. So they're looking at the behavior, and they're saying maybe this could feed back into refining our definition and getting a better idea of what stereopsis is. That's one research aim. Another one, of course, is just finding behavioral evidence of an ability that you've already defined, and that's essentially where you start. You start with some definition, as I mentioned, of stress or stereopsis, and you just see, does this phenotype exhibit, right, that ability in some way, right? And that's also fine. It's just a different thing that you're doing with your research. And then finally, I guess, improved translational results. I mean, it's sort of notorious that animal models in particular areas, the translation is not very solid. So in neuropsychiatry in particular, right, we have the neurotransmitters, the neurochemistry, the neuroanatomy, genetics, a lot of the mechanisms are in fact homologous. But the behaviors are not clearly homologous to the ones that we're trying to model, right? And I think more attention needs to be paid to that, right? Okay, so I think that's really all I have to say. So thanks to Tom for inviting me. And these are therapy ponies. I thought they would be appropriate for this particular symposium. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Carrie. It might be good to stop sharing your screen as well so we can see
Sure.
each other. Spock already has a question. That hand went up really fast, Spock.
There we are.
Oh,
okay.
Hold on. Spock and Seema have a question. Seema, do you want to ask yours first while I release Spock's speaking ability?
Hi, Carrie. Thank you.
Hi.
That was very, very interesting. I want to go to the last point that you made on translation in neuropsychiatric disease. Of course, that's sort of my interest. And there's sort of this, you were saying how the behaviors are not necessarily homologous, let's say, between rodents and humans. Where do you think the balance should be? Most of the behavioral tests we use, we're leaning towards, in the field of neuroscience, of behaviors that are relevant for the animal in a certain construct that we think applies to humans. Should we be like using behavioral tests that look at behaviors that are relevant for the animal? So in anxiety, like phygmotaxic behavior in animals occurs when the animal's sort of fearful of predators. That makes sense in terms of fear and anxiety. So should those tests and our understanding of fear and anxiety in animals lean towards that kind of behavior, or should we be developing tests of behavior that are, we think, reflecting some human aspects of fear and anxiety?
Good. I think both. I mean, because we shouldn't be expecting the animals to be mini humans. I mean, they're going to have their own, as I mean, they have their own stress responses, their own stressors, right? I mean, their stressors are not going to be ours. We talk about social isolation has come up a number of times during the day, and of course what counts as social isolation is that's a very complicated construct as far as I'm concerned. Putting an animal alone in its cage is one way of socially isolating, but of course, as we in the human case, and probably in at least some animals, a sense of isolation can exist even if they're in the middle of a you can be in the middle. I mean, for humans, just speaking of humans, you can be in the middle of a crowd and still feel very isolated. And I don't know what other things besides putting and separating an animal from its cage mates or something would be. So there's a distinction between, I think, trying to understand the ecological, the conditions that are likely to be more stressful for the animal. That's particularly with animal welfare in mind, right? And then there's this sort of maybe related but also separate issue of to what extent are those sorts of stressors homologous, or what is the relation between those stressors and the stressors that are applicable to humans, right? And that's the part where homology makes more of a is more important, I think, right? You can't just those are just two different research projects. One is for animal welfare and one is to try to improve human welfare, essentially.
right? Spock.
Seema's basically touched on my question, because I also picked that up, and I was trying to say, can we break that reliance on trying to describe these animals based on the human, let's say, blueprint that we think it is? And, I think ideally it'd be nice, and I always wonder why behaviorists and comparative biologists haven't started to develop a DSM specific to the animal kingdom.
Interesting.
Why aren't we there yet? And I
That
think
is interesting.
what I like what you said, Carrie, was you said, this reliance on explaining adaptive psychology or adaptive behavior. The maladaptive component is something which human psychology is focused on. And perhaps we as comparative psychologists or neurobiologists should be focusing on that maladaptive state. Because that's, when I think in the companion animal research, folks are interested in, why is my dog behaving a certain way? Why was my cat misbehaving? If we tapped into that, perhaps that would give us a new opportunity. Of course, it's idealistic. I don't know whether funding groups would fund us.
I can, yeah. I mean, I love that idea of a DSM for animals, or at least, I think that's a fantastic idea. Of course, we know the human DSM is is a bit of a mess, or maybe that's too strong, but there's a lot of controversy about the categories there, right? And some of my colleagues, actually, that's what they focus on is problems with philosophy of psychiatry. That's what they look at. But I think the idea that we can think about the conditions in which animals are not doing well, just to put it in the most neutral terms possible, and trying to define those and get some clear a clear essentially a DSM for that, I think is a fantastic idea.
Would have to be species specific, though, wouldn't it? You're not going to make a DSM based on rats.
Well, this is an
chickens.
interesting thing, because to what extent do like major clades and phylogeny share stressors, for example?
Or the responses to stressors. I guess that's feels to me that's what the DSM is really all about, isn't it? It's symptoms.
It's all behavior.
True. It's the way you respond to the stressors rather than what actually makes you well, or other or other aspects of mental health, obviously.
Right.
By the way, I have now opened up so that everybody can unmute themselves if they want to, because I think we've naturally moved here towards a more general discussion. So I want to thank you again, Carrie. I don't want to not thank you just because we moved straight to general discussion.
No,
so in the schedule, I had another 15 minutes for general discussion. That was just there in case people did want to discuss some things. And I when Carrie was talking about, especially at the end of translation, I'm glad Seema immediately spoke up, because Seema had before said something about how NIH or NIMH have issues with certain concepts and how to translate into animal research. And it really resonated with what you were saying about these human uniqueness and it's an interesting idea of having a comparative kind of framework to try and find more similarities at whatever level, whether it's homologies or convergences, that would make the translations easier, right? And you say, this is the kind of thing we can look at in many different species, and we can all agree that we're looking at versions of the same thing. Exactly.
Right.
And as somebody who works on the translational end, Seema, would that be a useful thing? It sounds like you're constantly fighting over definitions and over what you can and cannot talk about in animals. Other animals, I should say, as humans are animals as well.
Right. This discussion of and in the United States, at least, of resilience and vulnerability are not useful terms. It's really, we should be talking about the very specific behavioral concepts. So the social interaction test that I showed, calling that only that, so interaction, social avoidance, not anxiety, not anything beyond, what can be observed in the animal. So that I think is where, and then trying to determine, so this was where I think, Carrie, it's interesting if the neural substrates of the behavior in the animal, how different are those going to be if we're looking at an endogenous behavior of the animal versus trying to take something in the human and test it in the animal? Are we then looking at different substrates in the human versus the animal? It's not helpful after a certain.
Don't you think, I mean, in this group, as a, JB Johnson Club being quite broad, vertebrate anyway, comparative, maybe that's what we need in that kind of situation. If you just have rats and you just have humans, you basically just have 2 points, and any differences, you don't know if those differences are rat specific, they're human specific, or anything else. But if you have a wider range of species where, at least if you had some kind of character or phenotype that you could say, let's look at this in a number of different species. You could stick to mammals, but you could go beyond. You could go to birds, you could go to reptiles, and find something that like the hippocampus has come up a few times, right? And amygdala-like structures have come up a few times. Yes, there are large debates still, definitely across different vertebrate groups, about what exactly is equivalent to what exactly in different groups. But this, I was really intrigued by your saying, vulnerability and resilience are not 2 ends of a continuum. They are separate processes because they have different brain mechanisms that underlie them. But that kind of brain mechanism is something you should be able to test across different animals. We should be able to see whether this ventral hippocampal, and be that if that in birds is the caudal hippocampus or not, that up for debate. But whether that kind of ventral hippocampal inflammation has a correlation with how well animals deal with whatever to them is a stressful environment, and correlations with that across a number of different species would give us a better idea of what these kinds of phenotypes or characters, whatever we want to call them here, what they are, what does, and that, I mean, I know, like Spock says, who's going to fund it, right? But in principle, there's some interest there. And I think actually that the animal welfare, this is why I'm doing animal welfare research, because it's more fundable than fundamental evolutionary neuroscience. There is something there. I think there are more people interested in funding things that may lead to improvement of many species welfare. And you can only use these things across many species if we actually know what's common and what's not common across many species.
Right.
I don't know. I'm just speaking rather than.
I mean, I should just, I agree with that, and I think one of the problems, of course, is that in general, morphology and neurophysiology and specifically and genetics and stuff are far ahead in terms of homologizing various structures and molecules and what have you, far ahead of like behavioral homology, for example. The categories that we've got for homology of behavior are, pretty general, certain patterns of dispersion of, male versus female, certain hierarchical structures, feces burying, there's I mean, there's a range of different behavioral characters that people look at, but the range is not that big, and it's not very fine-grained, and there just needs to be a lot more attention, I think, to the specifics of the behavior, and then trying to see, what is actually, common across species within maybe looking just within a clade, and actual explicit attempts, I think, to define the concepts. This is not the work that most people do, right? But there's always a few of you who really do, I mean, who really are, maybe at their end, towards the end of their careers when they can start doing theoretical stuff, and it's okay, and that's fine. But that's the kind of thing that is really needed, is a bit more attention to the more theoretical, like, how does this phenotype that I'm observing, how does this affect the definition that I'm working with? Is the definition a good one in the light of what I'm observing? And if it's not, if it could be refined in certain ways, and how should I propose a slight revision to it, right? And that's the way, incrementally we get better and better concepts, whether it's vulnerability or whether it's, so you can, there's no problem starting with, concepts like resistance, resilience and vulnerability, introducing them to the discourse. I think that's an important step. But of course, then, they're still undefined, right? I mean, that's what I was thinking when I was listening to your talk was, well, what really do you mean by vulnerability? And what really do you mean by resilience? And we have some idea, but those concepts can probably be refined, but they have to be introduced, and they have to be introduced with some sort of definition, and then you have to sort of, refine them as you go.
I even though ran late, I did skip a slide in the interest of time that sort of tried to define that, but I think you're right. And we borrow from other fields, public health and psychology, who are way ahead of neuroscience in terms of defining resilience and vulnerability. So those are still challenges. I really like Tom's idea that comparative studies of these neural substrates would really solidify how important, whether it's a real substrate that's critical for the animal. If it's cross species, then and the National Science Foundation might fund something like that, because that's their interest.
I want to add to that, Seema, what you mentioned. I think in evolutionary biology, we've perhaps been a little, we've jumped the gun to focusing on characteristics that we consider are homologous. And I think Kay mentioned this earlier, convergence has been, I'd say, traditionally understudied. The ability that these neural systems could be convergent, they're giving us an output, but a very different, might be underlying mechanism, still actually lends us an opportunity to understand what's really unique about each one of those species. And I think in the same way, you think, we've always, the behaviorists have always, or at least as evolutionary, as a comparative biologist, I always look at the behavioral arguments and I say, well, are we anthropomorphizing some of this work as we look at our companion animals? Just last week, I heard an AI scientist talk about this. He said, well, maybe anthropomorphism is important. It's the way we relate to these animals. Okay, it's the way we relate to his algorithms or to the tech, but perhaps in the same way, it's the way we relate. I mean, to come from a companion animal perspective, at least within the field, there's the feeling that the person who knows the animal best is the handler, the owner, who can really describe that anatomy. And that's kind of perhaps out of left field, but instead of being totally objective, maybe embrace that subjectivity and describe the animal that way. And Carrie, that's just it's probably late afternoon. I've had too many Coca-Colas at this point in time.
Yeah, Kay, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to comment on this, the people who are doing, using the non-mammalian species. I think the people who try to understand the rather the comparative, what in your term, like evolutionary biology perspective, and they try to sell their model and to understand, to sell the model, saying that it's useful for understanding human stress. They tend to start with the idea that it's conserved, And I think we know that it's not really conserved. But people are not necessarily interested in the evolution by itself, but they are using non-mammalian species. And so it's so easy to sell in a shortcut way that when we say it's conserved, because since it's conserved, it's useful to study this species. And this, I really think that we have to stop this, because otherwise people outside of the area use this idea. And I see many times that they start with the introduction that since it's conserved, and that the people refer this statement, so I think when we look at in detail, that we actually know that it's not that conserved. Especially that's what I know is especially in teleos and tetrapods, they're quite different, and more I know teleos that I don't see the conservation. And just it's so easy to sell the idea, and this I think I quite insist this idea that just to say that it's conserved, it's easy, and to this is, so we have to go in both ways. That definition is important, but we have to think that our definition is a mammalian centric definition, because we are human, we are mammals. There's a certain point that we cannot get out of this, and the anatomical term, it's kind of complementary to define what I think at certain point we cannot really know how the stress on the animal. Maybe at certain point we can, until certain point we can know, but probably there's the point that we cannot know. And I think what we can define is still the mammalian-centric definition, and I think it's important not to forget about this.
And we definitely saw that today a few times. Sorry, yeah.
I was just like there was two different points. I think the first point about selling the research, that's kind of, it's like, what's in it for us, right? As humans, that's always the question. That's always the question. And I do think, if it could be made clear that understanding the human requires you to know the comparative context, because we are in phylogeny too. We can't just study the humans as if they were this punctate species all by themselves. I mean, that's the history that we're kind of getting out of, at least in psychology. But it's this idea that you can look at just one species, whether it's the human or something else, without realizing that species has its place in phylogeny, and that you can't forget that place. That place conditions everything else that you're doing with the species, right? So I think there's a way to sell what, more comparative work, even while even saying, because you can't understand the human unless you understand the phylogenetic context, right? I mean, you can't, you just can't really. The second point though, so that was the sales point is the second point, oh, now I've forgotten. What was
it mammal-centric views? And
the mammalian, yeah. I am not yet convinced that we, so for example, brains, there are different, there are hierarchies of characters. They're nested too. So we know what a mammalian brain is, but we also know which, invertebrate brains as well. And we know what, you know, what a brain is. We know what a neuron is, and we use the giant squid neuron as a model, you know, for various purposes. Even while it's not a mammalian neuron, but it's just a phenotype of the same neuron character. So it seems to me that at least in many areas, we do you know, there is a mammalian, you know, character for various things, but then there's also ones that are you know, vertebrates in general rather than just mammals. And then of course there's characters that are, you know, common to invertebrates and vertebrates, and then of course plants and so forth. So I'm not so sure that we should, you know, I'm not so sure that our perspective is in some way necessarily restricted to like mammals or even humans. That we
I think it's a matter of use of the terminology. For example, when we talk about emotion, I think emotion exists, aggressivity exists in cattle, it's in many animals. But when we talk about emotion in a general term, often when we, you know, there's a problem in control of emotion. So the emotion exists, but what often we use the term assuming that what we use, you know, consider the emotion in human. And when we talk about the problem, you know, of emotion, it's not the emotion itself, it's the control or expression of emotion. And this kind of thing exists in zebrafish. I'm not sure. The emotion exists, but the way that we control as human or mammals is that it works in the same way. We don't know, but when we use this term, people tend to think that actually it's, you know, actually it's when we say emotion, it's actually include the control of emotion, but actually what we know about emotion is the expression of emotion, but not control. We don't know about it. So it's just that when we talk about the term, there is we tend to use in the general, you know, term that we use in a daily life, not in the way that narrow way that we know by the presence is known by experiment. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's why I think that really, I agree that the definition is really important, and not just to use in a general term that we use in a daily life.
Okay, as I hear you talk about, you know, what we know and what we don't know, I'm kind of drawn. I remember, Carrie, you did a little review of evolutionary psychology, and the psychologists, Tooby and Cosmides in particular, you know, refer to the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, this hypothetical environment within which humans evolved cognitively. I think this is where we actually have an advantage, because we look at these animals, and particularly domesticated animals that we've kind of worked, you know, let's say we've assimilated into our modern environments. We actually know what types of original environments or ecologies these animals evolved in. So we have a hypothetical starting point for the state. And now we can kind of predict to say, okay, how have our modern environments changed that? Yeah, classic example, Tom, you probably, the red jungle fowl? I think they did some retinal experiments on that, showing, okay, in these enclosed environments, how does it impact, you know, the eye itself? So again, there's an opportunity for us there.
Yeah, the comparative approach, looking at other animals, can again tell us something about humans, is what you're saying. But in this case, yeah, about the processes that we may have gone through by analogy, maybe.
Yeah, by analogy, closest.
I mean, that comes into that whole field of, you know, self-domestication and all those kinds of things, isn't it? Yeah. Right. I think we we should probably wrap up. We're about 10 minutes over the official end, but that's good. I mean, discussion was had, which is a good thing. I'm going to officially stop the recording here.